Hello.
Hi, Joe. Can you hear
Hi.
me?
I can, and I just wanted to pop on a little bit earlier to make sure that everything was okay and I could access it this time. So you can hear me okay?
Yes,
Perfect.
I can. You're a little faint, but I'm not
Uh-oh.
sure if that isn't my end. I'm checking mine.
I've got my speakers up all the way.
Audio. Okay. All righty.
I will speak more loudly. I don't want to shout.
Well, it might just be me, Joe. So I'm checking things out here.
Can you hear me better, Sarah, when I speak more
Thank
loudly?
you so much for doing it, Joe.
Sure. We're glad to. Hope it's
I
helpful.
can definitely hear you.
Okay, good. Can you hear me better? I'm talking much louder. I try in most instances to avoid shouting.
Let's see.
Or emailing in all caps, right?
Right.
Uh-oh. Somehow I lost you. Sarah, did I just lose you?
Oh, no, Joe, it's me. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but I can't see you.
Okay, good. Yeah, I'm evidently messing around too much.
Um,
I'm gonna try the other computer.
I mean, I can hear, but I can't see anyone. Uh-oh. This is what happened the last time.
Okay. Joe, can you hear Sarah?
Sarah, I can hear you, but I can't see you.
Can't see me. Okay. All
I
right.
can see you.
Hey, Sam.
Hi.
Okay, let's see. There we go. I can see you now.
Oh, good. Good.
Perfect. Now I'm going to not click on anything, adjust anything at this point.
Yeah.
Hi, Sam.
Hello.
I want to make sure I got on here a little bit earlier just to make sure I didn't have the problems that happened last time where for some reason you all couldn't see or hear me. Things clearing up a bit more up there in terms of the smoke?
Yes, indeed.
Good. I'll tell you, it's sure nice to see some blue sky and sun down here.
Oh, I'll bet. Yeah. No, we sat out by the creek this evening, and it's the first time in a dog's age that it's just been beautiful.
Nice. Same here down here. Yesterday it was quite chilly, but today it's warmed up, and I think we're having a warming trend through the rest of the week.
Yeah. So Joe, where do you ever hike up this way?
I do. Herman's Gulch, of course.
Yeah. Sometime we
Grays and Tories.
Yeah.
Oh, do you hike?
I definitely do. Yeah.
I was up at it's kind of on the other side of the mountain, but was up at Butler Gulch not too long ago.
Cool.
Yeah. What's the one that's off of Herman's Gulch? Is it Watrous?
Watrous. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And there's a great loop from Watrous that comes back to Plume, and there's a subset of that drops down to the bridge to nowhere. It's about a 3.5 hour round trip.
Nice.
Just beautiful.
Nice.
Fall.
I've heard a lot about Mount Parnassus, but I have not done it. Have you done that one?
Parnassus, that's over in Summit, right?
I think it's closer to Silver Plume.
Parnassus.
I think, and I could be mistaken.
I have not done Parnassus.
Okay. This is a 13, close to a 14er.
Right, right. Cool. Gallery view. Okay. Kathy, Frank, Mayor Sam. We're missing Chris and
Barbara should be on shortly.
good. So we're almost there.
Hi, Kathy. Hi, Frank.
Hello. Can you guys hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Okay, great.
Sarah said I was a little bit faint. Can you all hear me okay?
I can hear you great.
Okay, good.
Sasha. Cool.
Of course, there's also always beer stat, right, Sarah? I haven't done beer
Oh my
stat in a long time.
I did it again for the first time last year after years. And I mean, there's nothing not beautiful about
It really
any
is.
option.
I
Yeah.
always love to see the
Hey,
mountain
Marty.
goats up there.
Yeah.
Hi, Marty.
Evening. How are you? Oh, Kathy, how are you? Oh, you're muted. Okay. Hi, Sasha.
Hey, Marty. Hi, everybody.
Hi, Sasha.
Hi, Joe.
Hi, Marty. How are you?
I'm, leery of this infernal device, and our communications going directly to Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump, Dick Cheney, and Ted Williams' head. Other than that, I'm fine. Thank you.
At least you know them by name.
That's right. I was going to say,
Or
Marty, did
something,
you
or something that can be repeated anyway.
right, right. Hey, Chris.
Hey, guys.
I think we're good.
Hi,
Sam, are
Chris.
we good?
I think we're just waiting for Barbara now.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, Marty, I swear
Hi,
I heard you
Chris.
say Vladimir Putin.
Yeah. Or actually, as it's pronounced correctly, Vladimir.
Hey, Marty, what? You're cutting out a little bit.
Says my internet connection is unstable.
Okay, yeah.
IUPR output doing something, which means nothing to me.
Joe, one of the things I thought of recirculating was, and this is self-flagellation, we're at some point soon after this call, the rules of engagement that we established for ourselves. I did not follow them at a recent meeting, and I think they're a good reminder. So maybe just as part of our follow-up, we do something like that. Hey, Barbara.
Hey, Barbara.
And it looks like Tammy's on. Tammy's on. Cool. All righty.
Yeah.
Sam.
Yep. Everybody here? Yep.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Let's call the meeting to order at 7:02. I don't have the agenda right here in front of me tonight, so you kind of have to help me along. Probably ought to do a roll call first. We got Frank, Chris, Sasha, Sarah, Marty, Kathy, and me. It looks like we're all here. And we've got Barbara and Joe. Thank you for doing this for us. I don't guess we have any other administrative items to take care of, do we?
I don't think so.
So we can get right into the training. I'll turn it over to Joe and Barbara.
All right. Well, hi, everyone. We want to thank all of you for making the time for this training session tonight. All of you devote considerable time and effort on a voluntary basis on behalf of the town and its citizens, and your service is invaluable and much appreciated. Let's be clear, the town couldn't operate, or at least not as well, without you all. So this is a training session for the Board of Trustees, and we can't emphasize enough how important it is to be mindful of your position and role as a trustee. You are guardians and stewards of the town, and you're charged with carrying out the public trust. This role supplants other roles you may have when it comes to the town of Silver Plume, and it's often described as a 24/7 rule. So when addressing or discussing town business, all of you operate as a collective we rather than I. And so there are basic guidelines, and Sarah, I'm sorry, can all of you see me? It looks like my square has disappeared for some reason. In the Hollywood squares here.
Yeah, Joe, it has disappeared. We see your name. So can you just continue, and I'll ping Tay and see if she's able to. Oh, there you are.
I'm back. My square is back.
You're back.
Okay, so as I was saying, it's really important for all of you collectively as a board to think of your role in working together as we rather than I individually. And these are all basic guidelines, and I know some of you have been on the board for a number of years, and some of you were on the board previously. But again, we can't emphasize enough how important it is to always keep in mind your role as a trustee. And those guidelines really inform everything that we're going to discuss tonight. We thought it would be most helpful for Barbara and I to present kind of an overview of the topics that we think would be helpful for the training session tonight. And then once we've provided that overview, then we can open it up to some of the questions that have been posed, and there may be some follow-up questions from there that some of you may have. So I think that in that way, we kind of try to keep it on track as much as possible and focused, given the limited time that we have and the number of subjects that we want to cover tonight. But at the same time, trying to keep it as flexible and informal as possible so that all of you can hopefully get as much out of it as possible. And we appreciate all of the questions that you've all posed and hope to address those as much as possible tonight. And the topics that we've identified that we'd like to discuss in this training session would be the procedure and requirements of open meetings, ethics requirements, including conflict of interest matters, staff management, CIRSA and liability matters, and issues regarding the resignation or removal of members of the board, should that ever arise. That's a lot to cover in one night, but We thought we would start with the open meetings requirements under the Colorado Sunshine Law. And some of this, again, I know you've participated in these training sessions before, but just to briefly go through kind of an overview of the open meetings requirements. First of all, it's really important to keep in mind that the term meeting refers to any kind of gathering which is convened or conducted to discuss town business. So that includes in-person meetings. It includes telephone conferences. It includes electronic gatherings, and it includes emails as well. And under the open meetings law, you have to have an open meeting with notice to the public if there are 3 or more members of the board who are conducting or discussing business related to the town. There is an exception under the statute for gatherings that you might have or meetings that you might have in that are incidental to town business. For example, if you were at a town picnic or some type of gathering that is not for the purpose of conducting business. But there, it's still really important to keep in mind that while you could, obviously gather at a public function or something like that, you just want to avoid discussing town business. And then it's always important to keep in mind too the public perception associated with any gatherings. As far as the meetings that have been conducted over the last number of months, which have been a challenge, I'm sure, for everyone, the town did adopt, as I'm sure you all know, a resolution to allow Zoom meetings for your public meetings and for executive session. If any of you need to review that resolution, we can have Tammy provide a copy to you. What's important to keep in mind with that resolution is that it doesn't cover any quasi-judicial meetings that may be necessary. And so far, it's my understanding you haven't had to conduct a quasi-judicial meeting for any reason. But should that arise in the future, it would need to be addressed since your resolution does not allow a Zoom meeting for that purpose. And it's my understanding that the Zoom meetings have been recorded. I know we discussed a number of months ago, and time flies. I think it was Sarah and Sasha who were going to work on archiving the recordings. I'm not sure what the status of that is, but if that's in process or something that can be done, we would strongly encourage that. I know, in addition, there have been the board meetings which have continued to be minutes have been taken of the board meeting, and that's important to maintain the minutes as well, because it's my understanding that some of the recordings, maybe the quality of the recording may not be as clear as might be desired. So I think it's good to have the both the recording of the Zoom meetings and the minutes that are still being taken. I know some of you had some questions about just management of the meetings and documentation. I don't know if by documentation you wanted to address more what documentation should be maintained, or if you had specific questions in that regard. And Barbara, I don't know if you have anything to weigh in on what I've said so far.
Well, just a couple of things. I don't know why the town wrote a resolution saying that it could not use Zoom for quasi judicial meetings. Does anyone know why you made that decision? Okay. Does anybody know who wrote the resolution? Okay, so that's something that we can correct pretty easily.
Barbara, I'm sorry. Tammy, I believe we just adopted. I believe we adopted one that was forwarded to us by the county.
Okay, that's great.
We
So,
may not have been aware of that at the time.
oh yeah, it's something we can correct really quickly. And we don't foresee anything coming up. But then again, you know, Joe and I don't always know what's going on in town. But just as a refresher too, the distinction between a legislative meeting and a judicial meeting, a quasi-judicial meeting is when you have an applicant for a permit or an approval. In Plume, it would be a land use approval, or it might be a license or something like that. It requires a public hearing, and someone puts on evidence to the board showing how they have complied. Everybody ready? Okay, I'll start over again. And in the quasi judicial, that's where you sit like a judge and a jury. And someone comes to you and says, we want this land use approval. We want to put this facility here. We want a conditional use permit. That's a quasi judicial proceeding versus legislative, where you're actually thinking of adopting a resolution or an ordinance. So just let us know if you hear of somebody coming into you seeking a land use permit or application, because you may be in a quasi judicial setting. I know that Rick Caldwell handles land use things for you, but we don't always know what's in front of you. So just let us know if something's coming up. And, you know, the mayor can, any one of you can let us know. Just shoot us an email saying, oh, we think there's a quasi judicial, and we can just strike that exclusion from your last resolution and you can adopt the resolution again. Okay.
And actually, let me have the resolution in front of me, and what it specifically states as far as that goes is quasi-judicial matters and public hearings on quasi-judicial matters shall not be held, but shall be continued to a date certain. So I don't know if it outright bars quasi-judicial hearings by electronic meetings, but it's just something to address and make sure that should it come up, that we appropriately address that and make sure that there aren't any issues, and make sure that the proceedings move forward.
Yeah, all you need to do is pass a resolution getting rid of that sentence. Kathy, are you raising a hand over there?
Yeah, I'm wondering why, if it's just a matter of voting, can we go ahead and get that done? So in case it comes up, we can handle it on Zoom, because I think we've been pretty close on a couple of our board meetings so far to approaching that line.
I think the problem we have right now is this meeting's not noticed for any business other than board training. So
Okay.
to take an official action, you'll need to convene a meeting.
Okay, so we could cover that on our next board meeting if so desired.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm gonna strike that
Yeah.
sentence. Good question. Thank you.
Mhm. And I don't know if there were any other specific questions about managing Zoom meetings. I did want to make one comment and just expand upon the Zoom format. There was a to give you an example, there was a public hearing a while ago on the short-term rental ordinance. And I thought it was handled very well, in that the mayor and Sarah had worked on, I think along with Tay, in
And Sasha.
obtaining the names of people who wanted to make a comment during the public comment section. And I thought that worked very well in terms of setting forth a specific time period for comments. And then at the end of the public comments, then what needs to happen is that is closed, and then the board moves forward with deliberating unless the mayor opens it up for, further questions or follow-up. But one issue for the board to perhaps consider is, as part of this ongoing Zoom format, there's the option for people to make comments using the chat function. And so you may want to think about monitoring that moving forward, so that if someone, for example, has already made a comment in the public comment section of the meeting, do you want to open that up to further comment? Do you want to allow people who have already commented publicly to continue making comments via chat? But in any event, once the deliberation process has started, there should not be any comments using the chat function. So I just wanted to identify that in terms of a possible issue with management of your Zoom meetings.
Yeah, I guess there's no magic to it, and people are learning a lot, but the very best way to do it is at the beginning of the meeting to say to everybody that's on the Zoom, how many of you are going to make a comment tonight? You have someone write down those names, the clerk or whomever can write down everybody's names. And then when it's time for public comment, you call on everybody one at a time. And that avoids everybody trying to talk at once. And we all know how difficult it is for the chair of the meeting to be able to focus on what he's trying to do for the meeting, and at the same time be aware of people raising their hand or sending in something on the chat function. So we recommend to you that you take people's names at the beginning of the meeting and then call on people one at a time. And then when the public is finished speaking, you close down public comment. We've talked about this before, but it's always a good reminder to remember it's called a public hearing, not a public speaking. And so often we find in the communities where we work that the public tries to draw the board into a debate. That's not what the purpose of a public hearing is. It's to hear what the public's concerns are. If the public have specific questions about what the town is doing, you can address those later in a different context. But as much as it's tempting sometimes to get drawn into a debate, that's not the point of a public hearing. It's for you to hear, not to speak. Then when it's on the agenda, when it comes time for you to deliberate, that's when you very methodically, and again, the chair turns to each person one at a time. Sarah, what is your take on what you've heard? Sasha, what's your, and goes methodically one person at a time. And then at the end of every board member having a chance to express his or her opinion, then the chair, or the mayor in this case, gives his opinion. And then you vote. And it's really hard to keep it that, what's the right word I'm looking for, that controlled, but it really helps you make better decisions, and it makes it much clearer to the public as to what in the world is going on. Any questions on meetings?
Sasha?
So there's the public comment portion of the meeting, and then there's the individual items on the agenda where different people from the public have comment on those agenda items, or do they need to make their comment during that period and then we address it?
Okay, thank you. I think I was confusing. I was talking about organizing a public hearing, which is when you open the hearing and you have the public portion of the hearing. And that's when you're engaged in a legislative or quasi-judicial process. The other, just let's say there's a regular meeting where you don't have any hearings on it. There's a section for public comment. And that public comment should be on anything not on the agenda that night. Then when you get to the agenda item, you're free to solicit public comment at that agenda item. But the general public comment section is the place where people get to air their concerns, their grievances, their questions. That is again, on Zoom, it would be a lot better if the mayor or the clerk or someone at the very beginning of the meeting said, we have public comment that's going to be starting in a little bit. We'd like to write down everybody's names who will be speaking, and then we'll call on you one at a time. So that same process works well, but I should have clarified before that I was talking about a public hearing where you have deliberation and everything. And one other thing we've noticed on your agenda that probably we ought to fix is it was structured so that there was a section of the agenda that said public hearing, and then you had many topics under that. In fact, each one should be an agenda item. Let's say at the meeting you had to adopt a new ordinance on marijuana dispensaries, and you had to determine whether or not somebody's conditional use permit was properly issued. So you had two things. They should be two separate agenda items. There should not be one agenda item called public hearing. Each one of those is its own hearing, okay? It's just separating them because each one stands alone as its little universe that has its own rules, its own record that someone can ask for independent of the larger meeting. Okay?
Barbara, again,
Marty?
I am.
Marty, I can't hear you.
Say what? Would it be appropriate then to have someone who was commenting on an agenda item during the public speaks out part of the meeting and say, okay, politely of course, we will be addressing that as agenda item number whatever?
Yes. So ideally, at the beginning of the meeting, the mayor, when you get to the public comment section of the agenda, the mayor says, we will take public comment on anything not on the agenda tonight. When we hit the agenda item, we'll ask for your input.
Better than telling everyone.
And I think Sarah,
Thank you.
And think of the mayor too as kind of the conductor of the process and setting forth the time periods and the with public comment and public hearing. Sarah?
Yeah, just a clarification on something that Barbara said. Again, I think it's just terminology, but Barbara, if we have a meeting without any public hearings, it's just 6 agenda topics. We're not holding a hearing on each one of those agenda topics, but agenda topics should be discrete for that meeting as well. So instead of having whatever the title of current versus historic issues, say, each one of, it shouldn't just be bullets underneath, it should be individual agenda topics under the current actions versus the historic.
okay, so your organization is typically old business and new business as the big categories.
Yeah.
And under there should be individual agenda items so that somebody can say, I'm here to talk about agenda item number 12. And, you know, we can send you and Tammy or anybody who wants an example of an agenda that's probably way more complicated than you'll get into to use as a format.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful.
Okay.
Yeah. One comment I would make just in terms of submitting the agendas, twice a month, is to attach any documents that are going to be addressed during the meeting. Because I know that Barbara and I receive the agenda, and that's helpful. We look at it to see if there's anything that jumps out at us or that we need to comment on. But if we don't have the attach documents, whether it's a proposed ordinance or resolution or application, whatever it is, then we're kind of reviewing it in a vacuum and not giving you perhaps as detailed an analysis or as helpful an analysis as we might otherwise would. So what we'd recommend is the agenda with a packet as need be. You know, sometimes there aren't documents that need to be attached, but oftentimes there are. And I know we followed up a couple of times and have asked for those documents, that if there's a proposed ordinance, that we'd like to review that as well. Otherwise, we're not able to give you, you know, the advice that we might otherwise would.
That brings up, we don't know whether or not the board members get packets.
Do you all receive a packet with the agenda? When I say packet, if there are any ordinances or...
What Tammy does for us is, and I think, I mean, this is to keep us up to date. When she gets materials, she circulates. And oftentimes those materials relate to the next agenda. She doesn't recirculate that information. What I'm hearing, and I agree with, is as a, you know, if anybody's busy, it's helpful to have the agenda and all of the emails with the attachments, not the emails themselves, but the attachments in one spot, and electronically, obviously. But I think that's a great suggestion.
Yeah, an electronic packet, and that's good for the public too, because they can read everything in advance. And if things have been sent out to the board in the meantime that you're going to be talking about, the public has no access to that. So remember, stepping way back to you have become a we, and your whole focus is to protect this public trust. You are a trustee, just like a trustee for you know, somebody's trust fund, right? Your only obligation is to the town, and the town is the publics that interact with you. So I think that would be really great. And in most situations where there's no town manager, the mayor or the deputy mayor or the secretary of the board, somebody agrees to work with the clerk to put together the packet before the meeting.
There were a couple of other questions relating to general discussion of meetings. So if any of you, do any of you have any other questions about documentation or just procedure for the Zoom meetings so long as they continue? Sasha?
It's my understanding that once we've started recording meetings, we have to do it in perpetuity. Now that they are digital, we have to be digital forever.
Yeah.
And I guess my question is more, how are we required to make the digital recordings of meetings available to the public as well as minutes? How do, in archiving these meetings, what part are we supposed to preserve?
You're supposed to preserve the recording, whether it's digital or tape, it doesn't matter. You're supposed to preserve the recording. And then the public can come in and ask for a copy, and you can charge them for whatever time it takes to like if someone wants a transcription, that's on their nickel. You never have the obligation or duty to transcribe a meeting for anybody. With electronic, it's pretty easy because you can just send them the link to the electronic minutes.
But then if they come in and ask for the written minutes, that's something that's public record and we just give it to them.
Yes, they're all.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
And I wasn't sure if some of the questions regarding documentation had to do with how long the town needs to retain certain documents. I know the town does have a retention policy. I believe it tracks the state statute, but my understanding is it hasn't been updated for quite some time. So that may be something to address, at some point. And really the bottom line is there are different requirements for retaining some documents that are different from retaining other documents. Some have to be retained in perpetuity. Some have to be retained, for 2 years. So it depends on the retention schedule. And again, I know that the town has one, but it hasn't been updated in some time. And I also understand that pretty much everything has been retained for many, many years. And at some point when the town gets up and running with the municipal code and maybe, has the time to actually go through a vast amount of documents, that's something that can be addressed. But my understanding is that some of those documents have go back to the 90s. So I don't think there's an issue with the town not retaining documents for the legally required period of time. But there is a state statute that deals with that. And really the bottom line, again, is there are different time periods for different documents.
That being said, how's the town doing on its project of codifying its ordinances?
Well, let me give you one comment. When she said 90s, that means 1890s. And we have not gotten very far, but I am developing a plan to get that accomplished. That would make life a lot easier. It's very seldom do we have to search ordinances back to the 1890s, but the ordinances that we deal with from the very recent past, being like the 1990s forward, are all available electronically. So we
need those codified.
We have about 250 of them to pull out of the books and just scan them and get them on a stick.
And then you take the stick to the codifying agency?
Yes.
That's right. And Rick Caldwell is working with us to assess options for a subcontractor, theoretically, that would help us do that, a specialist. And there may be, I know Sasha put Yo Person's service into trying to initiate the scanning process, and it's a huge deal.
That's an undertaking.
Yeah, it is. But I think we as a board need to support Tammy in prioritizing this, because she gets pulled away on a bunch of other things. So it's definitely something that I think the board has as a priority, and it's really finding the resources to support Tammy in whatever they are in doing all the work that needs to be done to gather and scan, etc.
And there may be grant money for that, just to hire a high school kid can do that scanning, right?
Right.
Yeah. So not to probably talk more about this, but we have iterated with Tammy about some options on that, and she's considering some of them. So.
Also, as part of the Zoom meetings, I'll just touch briefly on executive session. I think that my sense is that all of you are fairly comfortable with that process and what it requires, that executive session is an exception to the open meetings law. And executive session can only take place under narrowly defined circumstances as set forth in a statute, and your notice has to set forth the specific statutory reference that authorizes the board to go into executive session. And then what makes the most sense in this age of Zoom is that there be, some kind of dual process for recording your regular meetings and then recording the executive session. And I think all of you have been doing that with the executive sessions that have taken place recently anyway, the executive session recordings need to be retained for 90 days. As I think we've talked about before. The exception to recording what transpires during executive session is if it's a matter that involves attorney-client privilege. And then in that instance, what happens is the attorney makes a statement that the matter involves, in our opinion, something that's covered by attorney-client privilege. And then for that part of the executive session, then the recording is stopped. So just wanted to touch on that. There were a couple, do any of you have any questions on that procedure? Sasha?
My question is, so then when we do go into executive session, if we're using a board member's personal Zoom as opposed to the town's Zoom, how do we integrate that recording into our town records as needed for the 90 days, but still keep it privately held? Because if everybody has access to the town recordings, then the executive session can't be among those recordings. Does that make sense?
Well, I'm not exactly sure, but let me take a stab at it, and then you can bring me back. The best way to do it is to leave the Zoom meeting, put the Zoom meeting on hold, and then have a call-in number for the executive session. That's the easiest way to do it. Or you have a second Zoom link for the executive session only, because then you have the good thing about Zoom is it records, right? So it ought to be something all by itself, separate from this. So like for tonight, we would have, if we had to have an executive session about something, we would have had two links. One link to this meeting that the public would have access to, and then a link only sent to board members that we would use for the executive session. And we would say, okay, everybody, put this meeting on hold. Public will be back in half an hour. Board, use that second link that you got. That's the cleanest way.
My question, Sasha?
My question was more about the recording. If we're sending out Zoom links from our town account, all of the recordings are held in one space. So is the executive session recording open to everybody, or do we need to be finding a way to hold those executive session recordings somewhere secure separately?
Okay, well, again, you'd use a separate Zoom meeting or a separate call that's recorded, and then that would be kept isolated. Like hopefully you're keeping all your executive sessions isolated.
Executive session should be maintained privately. There's a procedure if someone wants to request it, a member of the public, for example, which has to be addressed.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure how to, that's not quite what I'm asking, but I'm not sure how to rephrase what I'm asking.
All right, so let's say you recorded it on, you set up the Zoom link. And if that link was the private one that we talked about that only the board had, you're asking, what do you do with that?
No, it's, so anybody that has access to the Zoom account has access to the recordings. Is that?
So you're talking about your kids or your family, or?
No, I don't know. I'll try and rethink it and I'll bring it back.
Okay.
Yeah, so for instance, Sasha, maybe this helps or not, you tell me. Not. We used my Zoom for the last executive session. So I currently, as a private individual and a board member, have the recording. I don't necessarily feel comfortable being the repository for that recording. Or should I be the repository for the town for executive session storage? The way we're currently structured is we have a town account And those recordings are stored together. The recordings of board meetings are stored together in, I don't even know where our location is at this point, which is another thing we have to figure out. But is there a way of privately storing executive session recordings in a municipal storage setting that is only accessible to the right people, the small number of people who are on the call?
Okay, so the executive session recordings, whoever makes them, I think maybe I got hung up on who's making it. That doesn't matter. Whoever makes it, because it's not your Zoom. You just initiated the account, right? You set up the call. Whoever has access to it, the executive session materials should be kept isolated from the general minutes and general recordings that the public could request. However they're made, whether they're made by Sarah or Sasha or it doesn't matter how they're made. They need to be isolated from the generally available, because as Joe mentioned, certain executive session recorded materials can be requested as part of a court proceeding.
Yeah.
Okay, does that help?
Kinda. And I think, Sasha, we probably need to talk with Tay in order to figure out how to have a different storage area accessible to only the right people.
Well, in this case, the right people is only someone who makes a request to see it. So regardless of who recorded it, I don't know enough about Zoom technology. Like if I had set up this with a link tonight and sent out the invitation, I don't know how I would send my recording to Tay or to Tammy. I don't know how I physically do that.
Right.
But it needs to be isolated. Either you keep it or you send it over to the town repository for executive sessions.
Right. And that, got it. Okay. Thanks.
And it may be the tech that you've been working with who could provide some help on that. I know, Sam, you mentioned there was someone you were going to talk with about computer issues, et cetera. So that may be a subject to work with a tech expert on how to best do that. There were a couple, unless anyone has any other questions on that subject for executive session.
Just a side comment, I would say then that the executive sessions recordings should be passworded. And that only the board members have such password to those sessions if it's going to be kept anywhere near the rest of the Silver Plume information. But anyway.
Mm-hmm. It's a good suggestion.
Well, and as Tammy knows, and we all know, the easiest way is to pick up the phone and ask Frisco or Breckenridge or somebody else how they do it with their electronic recordings. You know, everybody has the same requirement.
Mm-hmm. There was a question about issues with disability, someone who has a disability, and what is the town's obligation or responsibility as far as meetings are concerned. And so with that, we look to the Americans with Disability Act, the ADA, which the overriding principle there is reasonable accommodations. The town has to make reasonable accommodations. And that really is fact specific, but in most instances, what happens with any issues concerning a disability is that the person with the disability contacts the town and, lets the town know, the board know that there are these issues that need to be addressed, and then the town can address it if it's able to. There isn't an affirmative obligation for the town to create a, platform or assistance without being notified of an issue. There are some towns and local governments that have adopted a notice under the ADA, which is often posted on the website, that gives members of the public, information about how to contact and who to contact regarding any disabilities. And then the town can respond accordingly. And there is an exception that the town, again, will provide reasonable accommodations, but there's an exception if that results in an undue expense or burden to the town. So it really is fact specific. And again, some towns have adopted both a notice of ADA policy, and oftentimes there's a contact person who's identified in that notice. And then there's also a grievance procedure that if anyone who has contacted the town about a disability and has sought accommodations has a grievance about that. So that's something that the town could consider. It's not required for the town, to adopt a notice and grievance procedure, but it is something that the board could consider.
One of the unintended consequences of COVID is that meetings are so much more accessible now to the public than they've ever been before. But let's say there was somebody in the community that for whatever reason doesn't have access to Wi-Fi. Reasonable accommodation would be to find a location where that person could tap in through somebody else's computer. That's an example of a reasonable accommodation.
Or someone, I think a specific question was, what if someone needed an interpretation, an interpreter or sign language? That's something that the town could investigate if that issue came up. And is there someone who, would be available to provide that service?
The most important part of what Joe is saying here and what the law is that it's upon request. You don't have some ongoing duty like you do in public buildings under the building code to remove barriers and put in ramps. You don't have an independent obligation to figure out every possible disability that might be triggered by your meetings and have a Spanish bilingual interpreter who can also sign and people, you just don't, that's not required. But if requested, and I say, I want to participate in your meetings and I can't speak, or I want to participate in your meetings and I can't hear, then you figure out with that person how you may be able to adjust that particular person. You don't have to suddenly change everything you're doing. And I think Sarah had her hand up and then Sasha.
Yeah, and Sasha and I might be asking the same question. We do have now a family in town. The husband and wife are deaf, and they haven't actively participated, or I don't think they've requested to participate in a board meeting yet, but they're going to expand their house. They're going to need to come in and chat with the board and zoning board, etc. So it is a real need for us in Plume, specifically for those guys. And they're wonderful people. We've worked out a way of communicating on a 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 basis, and that might be able to be expanded in a group setting, but it's a reality here. Maybe not a consistent need, but a reality. The other concern I just wanted to voice is we are a volunteer community, and we do want to engage and involve all of our citizens, but we just need to realize that there's only so much. Like if we wanted to have a person on duty to do this, it would be a board member, and it would be a volunteer effort, and so we just need to be conscious of that. So anyway, Sash.
My question was just that, is there statute timing or guidelines for at what point, if they come in 20 minutes before the meeting, I mean, that's not reasonable, but how much notice do they need to have given us to be able to accommodate? Or does that all fall under what's reasonable?
You're right. It all
The
falls. under-
latter.
Okay.
Mhm. Because
So
as
as
a
long,
practical matter, it may involve finding someone who's available. It may be a volunteer in the town. It may be looking into, is there someone available in Georgetown?
It's also important for all of us to always remember that for any ability or differently abled person, the differently abled person has navigated the world until they came to you. It's rare that we're dealing with someone who just yesterday became differently abled. So 9 times out of 10, the person who needs access will have ideas to present.
Does that answer questions as far as that goes? I mean, really, it's a case by case, fact by, dependent on the particular fact pattern, fact base. There was also some questions about use of social media in your role as trustees. And social media is obviously so prevalent these days, but we go back to what we said at the very beginning, that first and foremost, in terms of your role as a trustee, is that it's really 24/7, and that includes time spent on social media, Facebook accounts, for example. And really, I think our recommendation would be to avoid any situations in which, you know, that boundary of I versus we is crossed, and that you don't, you know, set yourself up or put yourself in a position where what you're representing or commenting on your personal social media pages or accounts could be construed as, you know, breaching that I versus we distinction. You know, there's nothing wrong with, for example, a comment on a Facebook page, hope to see all of you at the town picnic. That's fine. But doing anything that involves town business should be avoided, really, at all costs, I think. Was there anything specific that beyond that any of you had questions on? Kathy?
Yes, I would like to be able to send out informative emails to the board. And I don't know how to specify that they're informative versus discussions. So like, we learned over the weekend that the post office is no longer looking up the PO boxes for those packages that they receive that are just have street addresses on them. And I don't have a way of informing the town. And so I kind of want to inform the board so that each member on the board could inform as many town members as they could. So without that becoming a discussion, is there a way that you guys would recommend that we started out with informative, or what we can do so that we can still converse between us without being business or decision making?
You are not, whether or not you're making a decision, you shouldn't be conversing among you about town business. But with the example that Kathy gave, I don't think that's town business so much as, like she suggested, just pure information. And there's nothing wrong with sending out bulletin, guess what? And then keep, you know, just don't editorialize and say, oh, that, you know, that darn, you know, try just to say, this is the information you need. And then all of you all, if you get something from Kathy that's just information, do not hit reply all, because then you've just gotten into a meeting.
Right. So in a situation like that, if someone wants to respond to Kathy's email with information or what have you, then it should be directly to, that response should be directly to Kathy. And the same thing with Kathy or any of the board members sending out those kinds of information or bulletins, not eliciting everyone's response. Let me know what you all think about it, or so then that generates a discussion that could invoke some problems with the open meetings law.
Okay.
Sarah.
Yeah, just quick, but one of the things we discussed the last time we talked about this, so it's definitely not a new question or challenge, was putting some kind of phrase at the bottom with our signatures that indicates, please don't respond to all, or something that reminds us all when we communicate using our town email or on town business. That's just yet another reminder that we should not respond, in as a discussion. We have asked, Tammy has asked us to let her know when we receive her email. We do that, but that also should go to her directly, I think, as opposed to all of us.
Yeah, and there's a hidden issue here that I'd like to bring out into the open. I feel like we're in a therapy session, a town board therapy session. On the boards that I've sat on and working with the boards and councils that we represent, one real big problem is that, yes, we all know we're supposed to do all our business in front of the public, but sometimes before that, we feel like we just need to run things by each other, right? It's a natural human thing. And so there are techniques for doing that. The best way, the safest way without having a meeting is to do it the old-fashioned way. And, let's say I wanted to propose major revisions to the zoning code, but I just didn't want to talk about it in public yet because I was afraid that what I was going to propose would be seen as stupid or whatever. The old-fashioned way, you pick up the phone, I call Sarah, I tell her the idea, I hang up, I call Sasha, I touch base one-on-one with my fellow board members if I need that temperature taken before I open my mouth and feel really stupid in public. I know of no other way to do it. And you also need to be careful that you don't do serial phone calls instead of a meeting to get around the meeting, right? So you don't say, Sarah, what's your vote on this? Sasha, what's your vote on this? Kristen, what do you think about this? That's a meeting. And you're just trying to get around the obligation to be in the public. But when you're just trying to figure out, do some temperature taking, because a conversation between two people is not a meeting. Go to lunch, just because we all need that reality check, because you'll get a great idea and you'll get all wrapped up in it. You need the other person to say, are you kidding me? If you bring that up, you'll be recalled. So I think that's the reality of that piece.
So with that, you can bounce things ideas off of board members, but we shouldn't be discussing town business with less than the entire board in a board meeting. So
you may speak about town business with just one other person, because it takes more than two to be a meeting. Okay.
So if decisions are made with those two people discussing it, that's inappropriate.
Right. Any decision has to be made in a meeting.
Okay. Because it seems kind of like we stretch that a bit much and decisions are being made with a small number of people.
Right. And let's talk about that. Let's talk about the why. Sometimes understanding the why is a lot easier than just being told, don't do that.
Yeah, Kathy, where has that happened?
I think we had an ordinance that was completely written without the board saying we need an ordinance. for such a thing, and it was completely written and then proposed. So the idea of it and the business of it was done not in a board meeting.
Got it. Sam,
So
you should probably
it's
weigh
that
in
sort
on
of thing, and like the website and the design of the website and those things, I think we need to be a little bit not long-winded in our board meetings, but upfront with ideas that are town business related in our board meetings.
Kathy. Yeah, this is of concern to me that you've brought those issues up, because I didn't have the same impression at all. So, perhaps not to discuss here, but
Yeah, that's all.
Can I say something here?
Sure.
The ordinance that Kathy was talking about, there was no business done between a few people. There was a proposal written. As a matter of fact, I asked the board before we even really got started on it if there was any interest in doing it. It was said, and that was done during a board meeting, and it was said that yes, there was some interest in doing it. So I proceeded between me and Rick, and Sarah had some input on it, on putting a proposal together that was presented to the board as a proposal. And I believe that that was absolutely the proper way of doing it. Is there something improper about that?
Well, let me go back to the why for a second, because that helps in these situations that are gray. What Sam said, I don't think anything was done improper if there wasn't a decision made or conversations of more than two people about town business. What's the why? Does anybody want to hazard a guess, or should I just plunge right in?
Go ahead.
The why is because of your role of holding the public interest in your hands, right? Going back, you are a trustee of the public trust, and your job is to respond to and work with your public. You are elected to do that. So any business that falls out of the reason why you're elected has to be done with the maximum transparency to the public that you are taking care of. Let's say I'm a trustee. Let's say my great uncle died and he left $1 million to my son, and I was appointed a trustee. I do not make decisions except those decisions that are in my son's best interest in accordance with what the guidelines of the trust say. In our situation, the guidelines of our trust say that all business has to be done in public. Does that help?
Marty?
Unmute yourself, Marty.
Marty, you're muted.
Now, okay, thank you. Thank you.
You start over.
Patience with my hand. The trail thing that you so kindly pointed out, which was just as appalling to me as it was to you, I acted on my own volition after being informed of the situation. And it was resolved. Now, is that appropriate, inappropriate, or what's up with that? How would you evaluate that? There was some markings on the trail. There was some graffiti, inappropriate stuff on the trail in an attempt to mark the trail better. Okay. So the question I have, was it okay to resolve the issue within a day, or should I have proceeded in a convoluted, and I don't mean that in a smarmy way at all, Or should I have dealt with procedural appropriateness rather than resolution of an issue?
Well, if it had anything to do with the expenditure of public funds, for example, absolutely the board has to approve it as a whole. If you're responding to an emergency situation and it doesn't involve the expenditure of funds, I mean, let's be real, like Sarah mentioned, this is a volunteer board in a community where everybody knows everybody, and there's nothing to stop you from saying, oh my gosh, this is a mess, and just fixing it. But if there's any expenditure of public funds, or there's anything that implicates a policy, let's say the town had a policy that they wanted it that way and you decided you didn't, all of that needs to be done in a meeting.
I can't hear you. You're muted, I guess.
Everyone's shaking their head. I can hear you very faintly, Marty.
I heard Barbara just fine.
Yeah, I hear
Okay,
Barbara.
I did too.
All right, I didn't hear Barbara, and on my
Marty?
screen, you're showing is muted.
Marty, can you hear me?
Yes.
Barbara, it looks like you're muted now.
I am muted now. I mute
Yeah.
every time I stop talking.
Oh,
So
okay.
because
All right.
otherwise there's background noise, which makes it impossible for people to hear.
Mm.
Yeah, Marty, your connection just may be the problem.
Okay.
I think the bottom line, Marty, was what Barbara was saying is if it involves the use of public expenditures, then it's something that has to be addressed by the board. If it's something that, you're on a trail and you think there needs to be some action taken because there's potentially a dangerous condition or something like that, or something that needs to be fixed, that's okay. But when you get into public expenditures, then that's absolutely something that needs to be addressed by the board.
Hey, Frank, are you there?
Does it,
And Joe, I'm wondering, part of the question.
Yes, Sarah, I'm here.
Oh, good. Yeah. Do you know the section of trail that Kathy was referring to, and is that owned by Silver Plume?
Oh, that is the trail up behind the bull's head that goes
Yeah.
around. I would say probably 90% of that is town land.
Land. So it really
There's
is.
a couple of small stretches of private that it goes across, but most of it is town land. And we can plot that on the county mapping system.
Yeah.
There's-
No. I support the concern about the trail. And anyway, I don't know, Frank, what do you think about advising Marty about trying to take action on that?
Well, I have to admit I could not hear what Marty was saying.
Okay.
So I'm not even sure what the question he was asking.
It was graffiti. It was inappropriate. I'll explain. It was inappropriate marking in an attempt to delineate the trail. It was overdone by a zealous volunteer. Robert had asked that volunteer to do some things, and they put like 3-foot markings on trees in blue paint. Am I correct, Kathy? I went down to James, who is the trail bubba for the county. He informed me that it was Silver Plume land. We spoke to Robert in his office. Robert and James met that night and went up to the trail to mitigate the situation. So the situation is resolved. It's not what I'm asking is it was on Silver Plume land. It affected Silver Plume citizens and the defacements of town property. Should I have made an attempt to make this a collective situation or just gone and taken care of the thing and have it resolved over and not spend more time on it?
Okay, so what's your question?
I think he's saying, did he have to go to the board to be able to do what he did?
Oh, if you're asking me, I would say no. I mean, that is a, what do you want to call it? It's on town land, so it's in town administrative action rather than an official hearing or anything else. It's just management of the town-owned properties that are designated as Silver Plume Mountain Park. So, yeah, I mean, I'd do the same thing if I were the one who was involved. That yeah, we'd go up and rectify the inappropriate trail marking. I just my feeling is we wouldn't have to bring that to the town board if we want to change the markings on a trail. That's just land management as far as the trail marking. But that's just my opinion. What would you legal eagles like to tell us?
Well, the first thing is that if it implicates an existing town policy or an expenditure of town funds, the town board itself has to be brought into the decision. You can call a meeting within 24-hour notice. You all know that. Tammy knows how to do that for you. If it doesn't include the expenditure of town funds or implies some kind of town policy, rule, or regulation, I don't see that there's any problem with seeking information and finding out how to fix the problem.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okie dokie then.
Sasha, did you still have a question? No? Okay. Well, I know there were some questions about conflict of interest with board members, and Barbara, we addressed that a little bit at the last training session in January, and you had some recommendations and kind of an overview with that.
Yeah, we had a discussion of what constitutes a conflict of interest, and we gave you copies of the statutes that control conflict of interest. But there was a narrower question that we got from the board, which was, what if I want to enter into a contract with the board to do work for the board and I'm a trustee? And that's pretty simple because the statute allows for that as long as you follow the statutory proceeding. You can't make up your own process for that, home rule or not. No municipal attorney is going to go out on a wing and say, oh, you can be less stringent than state statute. No, nobody's going to advise you of that. So what does the state statute require? If you want to be considered to have a contract with a town for street maintenance or gravel or copying ordinances, whatever it is, you need to submit your proposal to the town in an official way. And then you need to recuse yourself from any discussion whatsoever about the issue and not vote on it. And declare you have a conflict of interest. Recuse yourself from any discussion and not vote. And then if the town selects you, fine. And that goes back to the town doesn't, we weren't able to find, but we're not sure, the town doesn't require bidding. We weren't able to find anything that said that you have to bid on every contract. So the town would have to use the same selection process it used for anybody else. But as long as the town board member recuses himself and doesn't vote on it and declares his conflict of interest, you could, if awarded the contract, enter into an agreement with the town to perform a service.
And that's by statute. You don't have to develop a specific policy about that because Colorado law provides for that procedure. Sasha?
That applies to like members of your family and everything. It's all the same, right?
Well, that's when it starts getting murkier because there's also provisions that say you cannot have a direct or indirect financial interest in something that you are making decision on with the town. So if my son were going to do research for the town and the town was going to pay him for that and I was on the town council, I would recuse myself from any decision having to do with my son and any discussion. So it doesn't just mean I'm not going to vote. It means you don't talk to somebody at the post office about it. It means you don't talk to the public about it. You don't talk to anybody about it. And so the best practice is just if it has anything to do with your family or a business associate that could be perceived as conveying a direct or indirect financial benefit, walk away from it.
So don't voice any opinion on anything at all. Got it.
The perfect example would be if I really wanted my son to have a summer job, and I go to the town board and I say, you know, Justin really needs a summer job, and he would be perfect for getting together all those ordinances for you. I have already done something unethical. Doesn't mean I'm a bad person, but I crossed over the ethics that I'm bound by as a trustee to the public.
So there were some questions about staff management. And what's really important, we've talked about this a little bit before, is to keep in mind that the board is responsible for managing employees to benefit the public. The town, at this point, has delegated staff day-to-day management to the committee made up of Sam and Sarah. And that has to do with day-to-day management. So it's important to distinguish that from those issues that will require, you know, board input, and that involves decisions that could it result in change of compensation or discipline or significant job duties that have to be approved by the full board. And in terms of overall management and guidelines for staff timekeeping, may have talked a little bit about this before. What we would recommend, and I don't know if it's implemented right now, is have a standard timesheet that the employees fill out. That's the form they use. It's not something that they, you know, generate on their own, and it's an approved form, and they turn it in at specific times.
I also wanted to explore more at a later date when we dive more deeply into personnel matters as an agenda item. I'd like to just throw out there the difference between paying your employees hourly and paying them a flat rate. And maybe let's have some follow-up discussions on the pros and cons of both approaches.
At this point, Barbara, or later at another meeting? I'm sorry.
I think it belongs at another meeting, but I wanted to just throw it out there for people to be thinking about.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but aren't there specific guidelines laid out by the IRS as far as paying an employee a salary as compared to hourly that I don't believe either one of our employees would meet?
Well, it's up to the town as to whether or not it wants independent contractors or it wants employees. And we were under the impression, and may be wrong, that the people who work for the town are employees, not independent.
They are.
Okay. So in that case, you can pay them a flat rate per month, per year, per hour. It doesn't matter.
I just went through this with my employer, and there's specific guidelines. An employee has to be paid hourly unless they meet certain guidelines, and our employees don't meet those guidelines.
Honestly, don't know what you're talking about, Sam. So is this something that applies to municipal governments, or is this something that applies?
As far as I know, employees in general. Maybe this is a discussion we should have another time.
But just to follow up, the town has no constraints on it under municipal law in terms of how they pay somebody. Whether or not someone is a contractor is governed by IRS rules, and that has different indicia of employee versus contractor, whether or not you get a 1099 form. That's all spelled out.
But I understand that, but
most every town that I'm aware of pays their employees a flat amount per month.
okay.
And what's really important, and we've talked about it before, is continuing on with developing performance plans, job duties, job descriptions that are very specific, and that there's consistency and uniformity in the evaluation process, and making sure that the town sticks to that, because that builds trust and cooperation, the town and the employees. And so, we can't emphasize that enough, as we have done for a number of months, is just to really make sure that the performance plans are in place, the job descriptions are very specific, the evaluation schedule and time periods are clearly established and adhered to. Is there anything else on those particular issues? Someone had a question about supporting professional development. That's important, and we would recommend, to the extent it hasn't been done, that there are, training seminars through Colorado Municipal League that should be, taken advantage of to the greatest extent possible, for the town clerk, for example, to really make good use of whatever those courses and seminars are. And I don't know to what extent that's happened. But I think in answer to the question, yes, the board should support that and try to encourage that as much as possible. Any questions on that, on staff issues?
Joe, I think the challenge we've encountered is prioritization of training.
Sarah, sorry, you faded out just a bit.
Oh, sorry. The challenge that we've encountered on that over years is, the ability to prioritize training in support of professional development. And again, it's, I think arguable. Our staff have a cluster of activities that they're managing individually, and there's always pushback about what we need them to do, and this is in no way intended as a criticism, but putting their job first and training and professional development second. And so this is something that the day-to-day managers have had difficulty managing effectively. And so that's our problem, but the result is staff aren't necessarily taking advantage of the kind of training that would be beneficial for them and the town. And so it's an ongoing challenge, and I don't know how to address it in this setting, but to say it's a challenge.
Well, I think it comes down to as well what you mentioned, Sarah, prioritizing and trying, if at all possible, to carve out time that would allow that to happen. In other words, for the town clerk to be part of participate in a CML seminar.
Sarah, was the concern that the town can't afford the time away from the job to participate?
Not at all, no. I just think that there's a lot for our individual staff to do as in their roles supporting the town, and it's hard for them to prioritize the time for training. So it's not that the board does not support the training and that we don't have the resources for the training. It's push me.
Carving out the time with day-to-day obligations.
Right, exactly. So, and I honestly, Joe and Barbara, don't know that there's anything we can do about that on this call. It might be more you guys helping me and Sam with how do we help people prioritize or something.
Well, and that there's it's rare that there's a task that has to be done every single day at a certain time. That's rare, right? And so it's perfectly acceptable under the Fair Labor Standards Act and any other form that regulates employer-employee relationships for training to be a job requirement, just like anything else they do. So unless you're in a situation where literally every single moment of every single day has to be dedicated to perform the job, part of the job requirement is you have to do X number of hours of training a year. Mm-hmm. And then the town would have to help accommodate that. So let's say I were the clerk and you said, I need you to do at least one CML seminar a year, which is an 8-hour day. And you imposed it at a time when I was getting ready for an election. That would be an unfair demand on me. Either you bring someone else in to help get ready for the election, or you say, okay, when the election's over. But it definitely can be a job requirement.
Gotcha.
And it may be a matter too, Sarah, of you and or Sam, doing some investigation and research into what the options are for those CML seminars, what the time period may be, how often they're offered, et cetera. Because that could inform, this process of trying to prioritize and carve out the time to do it.
Well, and actually one of the best resources for clerks, not so much for public works directors, unfortunately, but for clerks, is the Colorado Municipal League. And there are hundreds of towns in Colorado that are run by a clerk, where they actually manage the other employees and everything else. And so there's a lot of resources there. There really are. I feel sorry for some of the other municipal positions that they don't have that same kind of resource. The Clerks Association is a really good group, and that provides access to any clerk to pick up the phone and call and say, I need help on this issue, plus training modules. And now with COVID, all training is online. So it's a great organization. The Colorado Municipal League will not lead you astray. I'm confident in their advice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Well, some of you had questions regarding CIRSA. insurance and liability issues. So we wanted to address that. And generally, we haven't reviewed the policy that you have, but insurance does provide coverage for board members under the Governmental Immunity Act, even for wrongful acts, alleged wrongful acts. But it does not provide coverage for what would be considered willful and wanton conduct. And that's really fact specific, but that would be extreme, situations in which the alleged conduct is beyond the scope, outside the scope of your role as a trustee. So go ahead, Barbara.
I can give a good example of that because it ties in with social media. Let's say Sasha goes crazy and on her, let's say her Twitter feed, she starts blocking people that she doesn't agree with. And she's out there talking about town stuff. And she's saying, this town is just crazy. We need to get different kind of people here. It's going in the wrong direction. And she gets a bunch of followers and they start saying, oh, you're wrong. I love the town the way it is. And Sasha starts blocking them. She just knowingly interfered with their right to free speech under the First Amendment. That would draw a claim against the town from the person that she muted or stifled because she is the government. And the government cannot interfere with the expression of speech except in very, very, very narrow circumstances. The circumstance is only if a compelling governmental interest requires you to regulate that speech. So if Sasha were to do that, she would be on her own, unfortunately, in a lawsuit that would ask for damages against the town for that occurrence.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, normal things in the normal course of your business are covered by your CIRSA insurance.
Right. And just remembering it, again, fact specific, willful and wanton conduct would not be. There's an exception, for example, for sexual harassment, allegedly perpetrated by a board member. There's an exception for that. There's an exception if any claims involve punitive damages. But if you are acting within the scope of your authority as a board member, there is broad coverage under CIRSA. I hope that answers the questions that you had as far as that goes.
Yeah, Joe, maybe a real quick, and Kathy, definitely weigh in on this one. I think if I'm remembering correctly, one concern was in regards to authorizing the use of the town park during COVID and, not feeling entirely confident that we had a handle on the plans for one of the specific events, and it was going to bring people from outside of town into town. Could we as a town and board members be called to task because we allowed an event to occur should somebody come down with COVID and say, I got it at this event at the park, and you guys are poop heads for allowing this event to happen, and I'm gonna try to sue you for giving me COVID, kind of thing.
Yeah, well, as I know I've said this before, people can sue you for any reason or no reason at all at any time, but whether or not it'll get very far in the courts is fact specific. And in the facts of the case of the park, I'm at a disadvantage because I never did know for sure whether or not you require people to get a permit to use the park. But assuming that you do have to give people some permission, some written authorization of any kind, in the written authorization, you probably said you need to act in compliance with state, federal, and local law. That's the end of your obligation. Now, you may have political ramifications. You may have people calling or complaining and saying, there were people in the park and they were 2 inches apart and they weren't wearing masks. That's a political reality. But legally, you have no obligation, because bottom line is no municipal government is ever required to enforce its own laws, because law enforcement is purely discretionary and budgetarily based. Secondly, when it comes to COVID, none of those are your laws, right? You didn't
Right.
pass any of them.
Mhm. I think too, the Clear Creek County public health provisions, which follows the state guidelines, could be helpful to review those, because it's my understanding that all of the municipalities, follow those guidelines. And those guidelines, by and large, follow the state executive order. And the Clear Creek County public health resolution, I believe, specifically states, these are our guidelines that have to do with wearing masks, for example, requiring businesses to display signs. And they actually have signs that you can obtain from Clear Creek County that could be used. But there's a specific provision that states social distancing as well is included as part of part of those guidelines, of course, is that we expect these guidelines to be voluntarily complied with. And they may not be active enforcement of those guidelines, but the Clear Creek County guidelines make it clear that in some instances there could be a fine up to $5,000, and there could be a jail sentence depending on what the judge would impose. So in other words, what the guidelines in Clear Creek County state is that while we may not necessarily enforce it, there could be some ramifications of not complying. And it also sets forth, state guidelines as far as the size of gatherings and for public and private events.
But there's no requirement that the town enforce it. It's not the town's regulation to begin with. It's a political question.
There were some questions too, as far as liability.
Sasha,
I'm sorry. Oh, sorry, Sasha.
I just had one quick question. If we were to post the county guidelines to that effect, we're not, as the town, responsible in any way. If we were to say that the fine is such and such for not doing something, if it's a county guideline, it's enforceable through the county. We're not held accountable for enforcing that rule, but we're posting that we are following the county's rule.
You would actually have to pass an ordinance mimicking or adding to the county COVID restrictions and imposing your own fine or penalty for you to be able to enforce it.
Marty, do you have a question? You're mute again.
I did. I actually got to was reminded for a change. And the sheriff, I've spoken to the sheriff, is willing to support our town in terms of enforcement of various and sundry issues, be they COVID, be they street closures, be they violations of our town government requests, such as we have the option of closing our streets. The sheriff, if that is ignored, the sheriff will come up and enforce that if available.
Or their follow-up questions
Yeah.
with
I
Marty's
wonder
comment?
about liability. Okay.
Liability questions concerning
Yeah,
COVID, Marty?
Oh, no, this is not related to COVID. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. There were some liability questions about what we might refer to as dangerous conditions around town, or potential dangerous conditions. And that would be concerning posting warnings or denying access, or providing safeguards at a buckled sidewalk, or putting up fencing, et cetera. Is that what you're referring to, Marty?
Spot on, ma'am. Just
Okay.
spot on.
All right. And so the question really is, what is the town's liability if it doesn't, post those kinds of warnings or deny access, et cetera, to potentially dangerous conditions? And first of all, in terms of liability, if the town knows that there's a dangerous condition and doesn't do anything about it, then there can be potential liability, of course. But maybe more importantly too, is that the town could lose its coverage for any accidents or injuries that occur as a result of that, because again, there was a knowledge of possible or potential danger, and then the town didn't address it. So, in the law, it's, really negligence issues. And so I think the way we would look at it is, if the town is aware of any such conditions, those types of precautions should be taken, because you don't want to lose or potentially lose your coverage for maintaining a dangerous condition. So, I think the answer to the question is, if there is a potentially dangerous condition, yes, the town does want to post a warning. It does want to deny access. It does want to provide safeguards at a buckled sidewalk, or provide fencing, because you don't want to, run the risk of incurring liability or losing coverage. Sarah?
Thank you.
Does that answer your question, Marty?
You betcha, by gum. Thank you very much.
So I have a question, two questions. One is, we have a creek running through town. We lost a child who was, Marty and Sasha know this better than I do, but years ago fell into the creek and drowned. And we have for years just not put a fence up along the creek for most of the length of the creek. The opening that Marty's talking about has been open for years, which is not an excuse, but for years. And so part of my question is, okay, the sidewalk, wretched condition in a variety of places. And it has been that way for years. And we haven't addressed it, any number of these things, because of the cost. We could definitely fix the section that Marty's specifically talking about at a much less, a much more reasonable cost. But then we have the balance of the creek that is not protected against any child. And I guess what I worry about is that we forget that we are a town that does not have unlimited resources. We are a town that has, for years, accommodated, quite frankly, worrisome exposure to the creek in particular. I live in a house next to the mountain. I have had rocks fall on my house, but I have chosen to live here. I guess what I worry about is if we start chipping away like this, how big does the picture become, and do we set ourselves up for, you know, not being able to afford the actions that we say we really need to take, you know, and how do we address that reality? And how do we address the reality that we have knowingly, for years and years and years, allowed these circumstances to evolve, and suddenly we're picking that piece of that fence there that's got to be fixed right now because, you know, anyway, so to me it's a very complicated issue.
I can help you there. The first thing to remember is your responsibility is only for public property, right? So it's not like you have some responsibility for fixing dangerous conditions throughout the town. It's only on public property. And the best way to approach it would be to put together a plan of when you're going to do what to which piece where, and budget for that in a methodical way and stick to it. That's your best defense, because then you're not knowingly maintaining a dangerous condition. You are like, no, we're budgeting for it, we're going to get there. And of course you'd have to, as a board, figure out the priorities. What is the most concern? What are we most worried about? And then budget and act in a very methodical way to address the problem. But again, you have no responsibility for anything other than public property.
Marty.
Yeah, I have a clarification here. I had mentioned I'm not talking about the gap, which the issue, you know, that we can refer heretofore known as the gap. We kind of have resolved the gap. I was talking more about the section of fence that is directly contiguous with the buckled sidewalk. That was the area I was talking about.
Okay.
I'm fine with kind of with what's been done. I realize that's a piecemeal approach, but we have people, I mean, there's a lot of activity. Not only am I concerned about our citizen safety, but I am concerned about liability if someone, and I think the phrase was knowingly did nothing, or not did nothing, did not address the issue. Maybe something we've talked about it before, as simple as saying dangers of putting something of a barricade, a barrier to keep people away from that specific area, and then talk to TJ about getting a grant to do more inclusive safety matters.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
Just for clarification, I'm done with, I'm over the gaps, and
I appreciate
that's not
that.
the issue. The issue is
I appreciate that, Marty.
by the sidewalk, and that fence, which Sasha had pointed out, is also decrepit.
Yeah. I've said enough. Sasha,
You too.
weigh in.
Appreciate you.
I don't know if this example applies, but I'm wondering if this is appropriate. When you go to the zoo, they have signs that say high touch area, use caution. Pretty much anywhere that a little kid will lick. So is that something that shows that we recognize that this is a danger? And so we just have a little sign that says, don't lean against the fence, it's 100 years old. Does that show taking responsibility for the fact that it's old and we just haven't gotten there yet? Is that an acceptable middle step?
Yes. Yes.
I was going to say that one thing you may want to consider, that the board may want to consider, is signage, warning signs. Before you have to get into incurring a significant expense and trying to figure out what the budget will allow. Putting up signs to the extent you haven't. And Barbara, I'm sorry, you were going to weigh in too.
No, I was going to say the same thing that Joe was saying. Put up a sign, have a plan.
Mhm. Kay, did you have a comment?
I do. I listen to, I have to participate in all the board meetings as a public works director, and I listen to these concerns about public safety. And my issue, I'm not a board member, I'm an employee, so I don't know how much weight my question has here, is I love that we're concerned about the safety of the people in our town, but what about the safety of the employees? The board also has a responsibility to them, and I feel like there are a lot of things that are asked to happen, and they want changes made, and they want all these things done with zero accountability for the equipment safety, the personal safety. There's no health benefits. It's an interesting dynamic to listen to people say, well, we don't want kids accidentally rolling off of this sidewalk, which no kids ever ride their bike down anyway. And yet they're okay with me operating a piece of equipment that has no brakes and could totally mow over a kid in any moment. Sorry, I didn't mean to silence anybody. I want to know, like, what the difference is. What safety precautions are safety precautions universal, or are they pick and choose because they don't seem to apply to my job or my safety or the safety of children in respect with the equipment that I have to operate.
So Tay, you're saying that you don't have any guidance on how to keep the equipment you operate safe?
I have guidance on how to keep it safe. It's totally ignored.
Who ignores it?
I was required to go to training, equipment safety training, and the equipment safety training educated me to say that the town needs to invest in better equipment and equipment that is appropriate for the procedures that it's being used for. So yes, no, I do not want a child to ride their bike into the creek. And so I put rocks in front of the gapping sidewalk gate fence thing. But I have to operate as a town employee as directed by this board, a piece of equipment that doesn't even have a fucking parking brake, which if I leave it to do a very standard check around the equipment and some kid happens to be standing in front of it, we'll get. I'm terrified that my equipment, the town's equipment, is going to cause a problem. And
that sounds like something that we need to have a board meeting about and put it on the agenda and talk about it. Because it's raising issues of concern about the public and public safety and an employee and a relationship. So I think that fits squarely as an agenda item. That
my issue is that I've raised these concerns for 2 years. So where do I go that isn't the board to address these issues when the board refuses to address them themselves?
Okay, that's a whole separate question that if you have put it on the agenda and the board does not even talk about it on the agenda and refuses to even consider a discussion or any input on it, then I would say that your recourse is limited, but because you're an employee of this board. And I don't know whether it's been on the agenda and how it's been discussed, but it's a very important issue that the board as a whole, this board, take up and talk about in a different setting where we have actually noticed it, so we don't get in trouble with having a meeting discussing something that hasn't been noticed. So that would be,
And that's not my intention here, but my question, and it's my submitted question, is what is the board's responsibility once they have been notified of all these things? What is the recourse? Like, I feel like this board operates without retribution. There is absolutely no recourse for harassment, inappropriate behavior, conflict of interest, misappropriation of funds, all of these things. So who do I go to besides the board to say that this stuff isn't okay?
right.
It's not pretty.
If you,
I
if,
mean, it's not pretty.
if you are raising issues about your own employment relationship.
Nope, I'm not raising issues about my own employment relationship. I'm raising issues about how this board operates and how they are trained to deal with public funds and dispersing public funds and spending public money and doing things in the interest of the public, which aren't in the interest of the public. They're in the interest of themselves. Many of these board members operate solely in the interest of themselves. And I don't know who, like, what training are you guys providing to tell them, like, this is where do they understand the statutes? At what point are they qualified to actually represent our town and spend our town's money?
Well, so one of the purposes of tonight was initiated by the board, which had a lot of questions on how it can do its role better. And
maybe I asked for a meeting with you guys before all of this happened. It was initiated by the board because for the last 2 years, they have dealt with a harassment problem that has been unmitigated at all. And so they think that training the board on some simple rules will make it happen. And I'm glad that the board is going to be listening to some training. And I know that you guys have had some important input tonight. But what I want to know is, where does the town, anybody, so even if it's me or Tammy, what do? We have to where does the board protect us? Where is the line for the board? I don't think they know that. And I don't think, I own property in this town. I don't think the board is appropriately apprised of their responsibility for not harassing, not accosting, not admonishing, like all of the things that are protected in a normal working environment, the board is responsible for, even though they are volunteer members. I'm not a volunteer board member. They are, and they are my employer. And I think what would be very useful is to explain to them what their responsibilities are as an employer with an employee. They feel like they can just railroad anybody that's in this position, my position, and tell them to do things that are unsafe, inappropriate, and they behave in a way that's inappropriate against me as a town member and an employee. And what I want out of this whole process is for them to have a realization, like, it doesn't seem like there's any consequences for any foul behavior ever. And there has been significant foul behavior. There has been, they have broken the law on so many occasions, and they have statutorily violated my rights as an employee on a number of occasions. And regardless of that, I fucking love this town and I want to do good by it, but I don't think I can do good by it with a board that thinks they can just act like a bunch of criminals. So how do you guys want to reconcile that? Were you aware of this? Joe Seavey and Barbara Green. I know that you have received reports of this over and over again because I know you've been commiserating with the mayor and the mayor pro tem, and I don't know what their story is, but I've asked to explain my side of it. Are you aware of any of this? Is what I want to know, because as a townsperson, I'm paying for you to appear at this meeting tonight.
I'm pretty confused as to what's going on. This is a training session with the board, and you know that if you have individual issues with your employer, that the mayor and Sarah are the people that the board has designated to be your supervisor, and that.
Correct. And they, as my supervisor, they said, in order to fix this problem, we're going to do training with the board. So I want to know if you are aware of these problems as our town employer. Sorry, as our town employee, as our town employed lawyer.
You want to know what?
Are you aware of these issues?
I'm aware that you have raised issues, yes.
In what sense?
I'm aware that you have raised issues. And I'm also aware that we're violating a bunch of laws right now by having this conversation in this forum.
Why are we violating financial laws right now by having conversation in this forum?
Because this meeting is a board training session for the board. Nothing else is noticed on the agenda. The board
needs to be trained on how to treat employees. This is part of this session. This is what I was told this session would be about. And unfortunately, a friend of mine died tonight, so I had to skip the beginning of the meeting. However, I wanted to tune into the ends of it and try to understand and glimpse if I'm being represented or Tammy's being represented in any way, in the fact that the board does not, absolutely does not know how to deal with employees. They are harassing, discriminating, monstrous individuals on occasion. And I want to know, if this is board training that the town is paying for, how are you training them to treat the employees as employees and not subservient to some kind of vendetta that they have for whatever is going personally wrong in their life in the town in this moment? How are they being trained to deal with employees?
By briefing them on the law of the employer-employee relationship, which we covered at the beginning of the meeting. So that's a narrow question about tonight's agenda, and that's a narrow answer.
I'm sorry, and you're right. I was absent for the beginning of the meeting and the briefing for the law. I will absolutely agree to that. I'm sorry, I was not here for that.
It's nothing to be sorry about. It's just, again, we need to keep focused on what we're doing here. Maybe sometime the town would like to have a meeting that's both staff and the board on a training session. That's all open.
Both staff are here. Tammy's here. I'm here. So
that's not the purpose of tonight's meeting. And as you guys know, both Tay and Tammy, we are limited by law to covering those matters that are on the agenda.
I want to know, okay, so then as far as the board training goes, what are one of the items on the agenda, the questions that were sent out was, what are the terms? What is the, if a board member acts in criminality, what are the options? As an employee, to apply to the board to ask for that person to be held accountable for their actions?
Yeah, that would be the first step, but we're past the 9 o'clock hour now too. So how does the board want to use the rest of its time in an effective way? How long do you want to go tonight? And let us know what kind of follow-up questions are generated by tonight, because there are always more questions coming out of a session like this and going in.
Yeah. No, Sam, please feel free to weigh in. I want to just check on, it seems to me we've gone through a bunch of the questions, and I'd want to just quickly check in on, is there one or two more questions we want to try to address in the short time? Tay, you raise an important question, I think, that I believe Sam and I should be thinking about, and then Barbara and Joe checking with you folks about on what appropriate actions we can take. I wish you had been on earlier for the broader context of the training.
I'm sorry.
Oh, no.
Yeah, and I think at this point too, the board did request that we address certain questions, and I think we have gone through most of those questions. There were a couple of remaining ones, Sarah, that I believe we haven't covered. Actually has to do with the what is the procedure for a board member to resign from the board, and what is the procedure for the removal of a board member. And I think those couple of questions were the last ones that we had. If all of you want to continue, briefly to address those questions.
Sure.
But I think at this point we've already covered the section on staff management and employment. So I think we do need to move on at this point.
Yeah, no, that's good. And Sam and I will definitely follow up with you folks on some of the questions raised by Tay. But I'm okay for another 5.
I think the board member removal question is really important because I felt after living in this town for 3 years, the board acts as though they are impervious to anything.
Okay, well, let's move on with the questions that the actual board members, had for this training
That was
session.
one of the questions.
Yep, it was.
And so for a board member to resign from the board, Colorado law requires that there be a written letter that's submitted. And then at that point in time, there is a procedure by statute as far as filling that vacancy, which can be by appointment for a temporary period of time, or it can be by election. If the board appoints someone, then that person serves until the next election. It should be done.
Nobody's resigning. How does a board member get removed?
It was a question that was posed by the board.
What does a board member do if they resign? How are they removed from the board? That is the most important.
That's actually
nobody's resigning from this board.
That was a question that was posed by the board.
The question was culture.
Tay, you got to stop for a second. You got to stop.
I'm not going to stop.
We can't hear you. All right, we can't hear you because you're shut. It's all distorted.
I would like to move to adjourn the meeting because this is digressing and I don't have time for this. I have more work that has to happen.
Then go home and don't participate. But
we have a motion. We have a motion on the table to adjourn.
I will second that motion.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Anybody opposed?
I would like to have a conversation, but I will not sit here and be talked over and not be able to understand what's trying to be communicated to us by our attorneys.
Okay. I don't think that's accurate. The question that the attorneys were given was, how does a board member resign? How is a board member asked to be removed? And she has stressed the resignment.
Excuse me.
Nobody's going to resign.
Excuse me.
That's not the problem.
That's enough. Excuse me. There's been a motion to adjourn. It's been seconded and voted on. This meeting is adjourned. Please end the meeting.
Barbara and Joe, thank you very much for your
Have a good night. Thank you.
participation.
Thanks, Barbara and Joe.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good night, everyone.
Joe?
Yes.
I'd like to be able to give you a call sometime tomorrow. What would be a good time?
Tomorrow morning.